The Bible is filled with inspiring stories of triumph and unwavering faith that uplift us and draw us closer to God. However, it also contains sorrowful and harrowing passages that remind us that no one's life, not even the lives of the most faithful servants, is free from hardship. Among these, there is a story in the Old Testament that I consider to be the most unsettling in the entire Bible. Honestly, I believe this story is not suitable for younger audiences. Furthermore, it has the potential to trigger painful memories and evoke past traumas in some individuals that I end this video. I want to talk to you about this passage. It's found in chapters 19 to 21 of the book of Judges. Although deeply disturbing, it carries powerful lessons that we must pay close attention to if we want to avoid making the same mistakes as the people of Israel in that situation. But before we dive in, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to my channel. All you need to do is click the subscribe button below this video, and don't forget to hit the notification bell right next to it. This way, you'll receive updates on your phone whenever I post new content. Sound good? Alright, let's get started. I want to read a small excerpt from verse 1 of chapter 19 in the book of Judges because this verse sets the stage for the story and the lessons I'll share with you today. It says, "The man was from the tribe of Levi." In those days, Israel had no king. If you continue reading this chapter, you'll see that the Bible tells the story of a man from the tribe of Levi searching for a companion. He brought home a woman from Bethlehem in Judah to be his concubine. However, their relationship became strained, and she decided to return to her father's house. After about 4 months, the man decided to reconcile with her. He set off, taking a servant and 2 donkeys along with him. Upon arriving, he was warmly welcomed by the concubine's father, who treated him with great kindness. For 3 days, he enjoyed the hospitality of his father-in-law, eating, drinking, and resting. When he tried to leave, the father-in-law persuaded him to stay longer, extending his visit by several more days. Finally, on the 5th day, despite his father-in-law's insistence that he stay 1 more night, the man decided to leave. Together with his concubine and servant, they journeyed toward a city called Jebus. As they approached Jebus, it was nearly evening. The servant suggested they stop there to rest, but the man preferred not to stay in a foreign city. Instead, he chose to continue on to Gibeah, an Israelite city belonging to the tribe of Benjamin. When they arrived in Gibeah, they found no shelter, as no one offered them a place to stay. At that time, it was customary for the people of Israel to provide lodging to fellow Israelites from other cities or tribes. Unfortunately, this wasn't the case in Gibeah. They sat in the city square with nowhere to go until an elderly man returning from the fields approached them. This elderly man, also from the region of Ephraim, invited them into his home. While they were there, the house was surrounded by a group of wicked men. They demanded that the guest be handed over to them. In a horrifying attempt to protect his visitor, the host shockingly offered his own virgin daughter and the concubine of the man. Tragically, the concubine was forced outside and suffered horrific abuse and sexual violence throughout the night. At dawn, the woman managed to return to the house where she had been staying, collapsing at the doorway in exhaustion. When her husband found her, she was already lifeless. The man then made a shocking decision. He placed her body on one of his donkeys and brought it back to his home. There, he took a knife, dismembered her body into 12 pieces, and sent each piece to different tribes of Israel, accompanied by a letter detailing what the men of Benjamin had done to her. The man's account of the crime horrified the tribes, and those who heard it declared that such an atrocity had not been witnessed since the days of Israel's exodus from Egypt. The people were deeply shaken and began to question what should be done about the murder of this woman, who was also an Israelite. But the story doesn't end there. First lesson: the consequences of that horrific crime are detailed in chapters 20 and 21 of Judges. But before we dive into them, let me share the first lesson we can learn from this tragic story. When we don't hold ourselves accountable, we are more likely to stray from the path of the Lord. Do you remember the verse I read at the start of this video? It said that in those days, Israel had no king. This means that when there's no authority to oversee our choices or hold us responsible for our actions, we are far more likely to act wrongly. Take those Benjamites who abused the woman to death as an example. Do you think they would have committed such an atrocity if there had been a ruling authority in Israel at the time? Certainly not. They would have known that a king or leader would arrest them, put them on trial, and most likely sentence them to death. Now, you might be saying, but Pastor, Israel didn't have a king, but they did have the laws of Moses. And that's true, my friends. But those laws were not being obeyed, and there was no one to enforce them. This is similar to what we see in Brazil, for instance. We live under a federal constitution that outlines all our rights and responsibilities, along with numerous other laws. Yet, due to a lack of fear, respect for others, or the certainty of punishment, these laws are often disregarded. Returning to the story in Judges, the Benjamites acted as they did because they knew they wouldn't be punished. The same can happen to us if we forget that our ultimate judge isn't earthly but heavenly, and nothing escapes his sight. The second lesson from this sad account is this: we must see every human being as someone made in the image and likeness of God. If that concubine, or even the daughter of the host who sheltered the Levite, had been seen with such value, none of this would have happened. And I'm not starting with the immoral and depraved Benjamites. I'm starting with the father and the husband. First, the host begged the crowd not to harm his guest because it would be a terrible act. But he didn't hesitate to offer his own daughter and the concubine to be abused instead. This shows he believed the life of a man to be more valuable than that of these two poor women. Then we have the husband, who sinned by standing by as his partner was taken, abused, beaten, and ultimately killed by the Benjamites. While he didn't actively offer her in his place, he also didn't act to protect her when she was as for the Benjamites. If they had possessed the love of God in their hearts, like their ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they would never have committed such evil. The Bible reminds us in 1 John 4 verse 8 that whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. Amen. The third lesson I want to highlight from this situation is that the further we drift from God, the more tempted we are to do things we never thought we'd do. If we read through the book of Judges from the first chapter, we see a nation that gradually drifted away from the Lord without even realizing it. What we witness in chapters 19 to 21 is the proof of just how far from God these people had strayed. If someone had approached them a few years before and said that in the future they would rape and kill an innocent woman, they would have probably denied it, insisting that they could never do something so cruel and filthy. But as we saw, that's exactly what they did. Similarly, if we're not careful in our relationship with God today, we may end up doing things tomorrow that we never imagined we would. We're not so different from those Benjamites. We often make statements like, "I'll never get divorced," "I'll never cheat on my spouse," "I'll never use drugs," "I'll never get fired for embezzling from my boss," and so on. But if we don't stay vigilant and committed to God, we may find ourselves doing the very things we swore we would never do. Fourth lesson now. Let's return to the story, because unfortunately, it's not over yet. In chapters 20 and 21 of Judges, we see that the Israelites were outraged by what had happened and summoned an army of 400,000 men to demand justice from the Benjamites, the tribe responsible for the crime. At first, the Benjamites refused to hand over the guilty parties, leading to a violent conflict. The Bible tells us that on the first 2 days of battle, the Israelites suffered heavy losses. But on the third day, after seeking God's guidance and setting an ambush, the Israelites finally won, devastating Gibeah and nearly annihilating the entire tribe of Benjamin. As a result of these battles, the tribe of Benjamin was almost completely wiped out. Men, women, and children were killed, leaving only 600 men who fled into the desert. This left the Israelites feeling deeply guilty. After all, the Benjamites were on the brink of extinction, as there weren't enough women left to ensure their survival. The major issue was that the leaders of the 11 tribes had sworn they would not allow their daughters to marry Benjamite men. This decision, made in a moment of great emotion and anger, led to a crisis. To avoid displeasing God and still honor their oath, the Israelites attacked the city of Jabesh-Gilead, a city that had not joined them in the war against Benjamin. During the battle, 400 men were killed, and their wives were given to the Benjamites. However, the tribe of Benjamin still had 600 men without wives, so 200 women were still needed. They had to make another difficult decision. The oath of the 11 tribes prohibited them from giving their daughters in marriage to the Benjamites, but it didn't say anything about kidnapping them. So, they advised the Benjamites to abduct women from their tribes who were unmarried during an annual festival in Shiloh. These women were those who danced in the vineyards during the celebrations. This advice was given so that the 200 Benjamites could rebuild their families without breaking their oath. And that's exactly what happened. Fifth lesson here is the fifth lesson. Every bad decision we make has consequences that we cannot choose. Let's take a moment to review. It all began when that old man decided to offer his guest's concubine and his own daughter to the Benjamites, resulting in the death of an innocent person. Then, the Benjamites chose to abuse and kill the Israelite woman, leading to the invasion and devastation of their city and the death of most of their population. Afterward, the leaders of the 11 tribes chose to attack the Benjamites, witnessing the near extinction of a people that had once been raised by God. They also chose not to give their daughters in marriage to the Benjamites, but ended up killing 400 innocent men in a war they themselves started, only to see poor women being abducted. What I want to say here is that you may choose your sin, but you will not be able to decide what the consequences will be. Unfortunately, you will have to live with each one of them. That's why the Apostle Paul left us an important teaching in Galatians 6. Look at what he said. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Whoever sows to please their flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction. Whoever sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up.